Hi, I'm Tyler Johnston with Johnston Realty,
And I'm Brandy Sorensen with Johnston Realty and ConverseCountyHome.com.
and today we're going to talk about appraisals,
Yeah.
the bane of everybody's existence, and the necessary steps that you have to go through.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, people always wonder who the appraiser works for.
The appraiser works for the buyer,
Do they work for the buyer or the buyer's
the
bank?
buyer's lender. They answer to the buyer, but they're working for the buyer's bank. So basically, when you go get a loan, you're getting it appraised on the property, da 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 da. But what the appraiser is doing is the appraiser is trying to make sure that the money the bank is lending you, if you don't make your payments, the bank will be able to still get their money back. So the value of the property is equal to what they're lending you.
So it's a good investment for them, yes or no?
So that way they've got the equity, they've got the security to hold on to it. So that way they're not lending $100,000 on a $50,000 property.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't see, I would say the majority of the issues that we see around Converse County, up into Casper, if an appraisal comes in low, you're talking, I don't know, $10 to $15,000 max. But that throws everything into chaos because there's the options at that point is the seller can say, hey, I'll accept a lower appraisal. We're going to drop the price. We're going to sell it for that because now that's the value of the property. It's been appraised. I know the value. Or the seller can say, I don't agree with you. I want what's in the contract. I want this price. And if you don't have a condition in the contract called an appraisal gap, to where the buyer is agreeing to pay that difference in cash, you're kind of stuck. You're at an impasse. So if the buyer doesn't agree, or the buyer, even if the buyer agrees but doesn't have the cash to pay that difference, the whole deal just kind of falls apart and goes away. And now the seller has an appraisal on that property, which we just recently learned is if it's a government
Yeah, like
backed
a
loan,
FHA or
FHA,
VA.
rural development,
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
those
They
will,
stick with that property for 6 months. So you can't, like, if another buyer comes to do it, they can't have another appraisal if they also have a government backed loan. That appraisal sticks with that property for 6 months. But that's the other thing with appraisers. It is that person's educated opinion on that day. And so then sometimes it is worth it to either have another appraiser, like, because they do sometimes come up with it a little bit different, or I use a radius of so many miles versus I use only such and such neighborhood or whatever.
we had one just recently on our team. The appraisal came in $15,000 lower, but because of the type of appraisal, so it was an FHA loan, the property was a flip property. So the seller had bought it at a reduced rate and was selling it for more than he paid for it within 6 months of closing. So the seller had to pay for a second appraisal to verify that the actual value was there because
And it
FHA.
wasn't, I'm just hanky.
Yeah, so the FHA is like, hey, I want to double check your work. So the seller has to pay for this second one. The buyer, of course, paid for the first one. And then the second one came in $5,000 over the contract price.
That's a
So,
pretty big gap. You don't normal. I'm surprised. That's a big
yeah,
gap.
so now we've got a $20,000 difference between the two appraisals. But the first appraiser had stuck within a certain neighborhood where the home was located. He had gone back further in time
Oh,
to come up with his value. The second appraisal stuck with a shorter period of time, but widened her area of search
yeah, it makes a
to come
difference.
up with her numbers. And so they appealed it, and the first appraiser said, okay, I'll change mine. And he actually came up $10,000. So then it was just $5,000 under the agreed upon price.
Yeah.
And then everybody agreed, and it
Yeah.
actually closed, thankfully, for our buyers.
Yeah.
But there's, yeah, like you said, it's an educated guess.
The other thing that I think people get misconstrued is that the appraiser, the reason I ask like who they work for, a lot of times like, oh, but the appraiser, they just do go with whatever you agents say. And I'm like, we have nothing to do with the appraiser. Half the time I don't even know who the appraiser is or when they're coming. I mean, eventually we do figure that out, but we don't pick appraisers. We don't,
Even the lenders don't pick the appraisers. They have a list, and so they send out their list, and only appraisers that they've worked with and trusted are on that list can pick up that appraisal. So even the lender for the buyer has no control over what appraiser is going to go out to the property and do the appraisal.
And the reason I think that a lot of times it does come in right at or near the value is because if we're doing our job, right?
Correct.
If we're doing our job, again, it's still opinion, but that's what we try and do is find what value your house. We do the same thing as far as comparing like properties and within the last 6 to 12 months in the same type of area. So that's why we usually come pretty close. Sometimes not if there's something different. But anyways, I think that's a big thing to point out. They're not working for us.
They're not working for us. They're
not
working
working
for the
seller.
lender.
Yep.
But, and then, I mean, you'll have some, I've had some here in Douglas come in and be like $500 under the contract.
Really?
Or $1,000.
Just barely.
And it's like, are you
'Cause
really
then you
telling
just
me
have
you're
to
just
do-
that good at your job? You can
That's
pinpoint
exactly.
it down to this. And I mean, you can make arguments. You could try and plead your case and say, this is how we came to this value. This is why we think it's worth this, and try to see if they'll change. But really, other than this one that just happened, I've never seen an appraiser change their original appraisal. But maybe it's just because they had hired that second
Yeah.
appraiser to come out, and then they kind of got to compare
Yeah.
and see what the differences were.
The other thing that appraisers do is sometimes they call repairs. Let's talk about that because some people think they can rely on the appraiser to catch these things. And I don't know if VA or if they used to call a lot more. I don't know, but I'm like, no, you don't want the appraiser. Hopefully he'll catch a roof there. He's not a roof inspector.
No, they're kind of just doing a once over. They have certain criteria that they have to meet based off of the type of loan that's being issued on the property. The big one that you'll see that isn't called out on like conventional would be like on a VA loan would be like downspouts. So you have to have the gutter extension. It's $15, but if you don't have them on the home,
Then
the
water
VA
runs towards the
towards the foundation, but
so then it makes it not keep its value as
keep its
long.
value. Yeah. But a VA appraiser will not allow you to close until that's been corrected. So, yeah, there's different things and repairs, and that's our job as we're walking through, like on a listing appointment, saying, "Hey, Mr. Seller, we see these things."
Yeah. So something to be aware of if this person, say you get 2 offers and one is an FHA or a VA or whatever, and this one, they're priced exactly the same, but this one's conventional. Those are things you also take into consideration.
Or cash,
Yeah, or
because then you
cash
don't
with
have
no
to deal with
appraiser.
any appraisal requirements or repairs. But if the appraiser calls out those repairs, nothing. I mean, the deal can't complete.
Close.
It can't
Yeah.
close.
Even if you negotiated other repairs and you're paying for this and that, that still needs to be. And the other thing I learned recently is that the government does not give you an exact list. That's why some appraisers sometimes will call all these, sometimes they'll call all the chipped and peeling paint, and then you think you've got one that's this one, they're going to call the chipped and peeling paint, and they don't. It just really, it really depends. Obviously, if it was real bad, but they don't say exact, but then they tell you, oh, you were too lax, or now you're too strong. So now you have to take, anyway, so.
Yeah, and it's just kind of, and getting to know the appraisers too, by meeting with them, talking to them, showing up at the house. You kind of develop that relationship, and you're like, okay, I know this guy is specific about these things. So
Once
if
again,
it's not
you wouldn't
done,
know until that one picked it or whatever.
Yep.
But
yeah, just when they show up the day to do the appraisal, you're
Yeah.
like, okay, this wasn't done. I know he's going to call it. We're going to have to fix it. They're going to have to come back.
yeah,
And some agents will be like, listing agents will be like, hey, I see these things. but don't do the repair
Yeah.
unless it's called for. And I've done that for my clients too. Like, hey, you're trying to save some money.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see what happens, see how it goes,
Yeah.
and just kind of go from there. But it is definitely something that you've got to be aware of the different types of things that are going to be called out, so that way you can let our sellers know. And
Yeah.
if we get a bad one, just say, I'm sorry, but we have no control over
Yeah.
who the appraiser is and what they're going to say.
Yeah. I
And
think for the most part, I've never really had too much of a problem. Yeah, there will be little things here and there, but overall, they're not, for me, they haven't been, for the most part, no deal killers. Like, don't freak out about it, but just be aware.
yeah, it's just something that we walk through. It's just another step in the
Another step,
progress
yeah.
or the process. And another thing that I don't think people are aware of, we as your agent, whether we're representing you as a buyer or a seller, we don't get the appraisal.
Yeah.
The buyer who's getting the loan has to give the lender permission to give us that. If we don't see the value, we don't know what it came at. All we're told is whether or not it met value. So if it met value, we don't even get to
Yeah, we don't know
told.
if it got above or anything.
If it's below value, then we find out because now we've got to make contract changes.
And then the required repairs, but we don't see the whole thing. Just
It's a
they
snapshot.
just say these need to be done.
You get a little list of things and we're like, okay, now we got to fix this. And then also when we get those required repairs, that's another negotiating point between the buyer and the seller because
Maybe
it
the
is
seller
negotiable.
doesn't have the money to fix those, or vice versa. The buyers are like, hey, we'll just come and because we want this really paint, or just depends.
It's always another spot to negotiate and see what you can kind of do to work together to make sure the buyers get to buy the home that they want, the sellers get to sell.
Yeah.
So
Lots of moving points.
yeah. And if you guys have questions or if you've ever run into issues with your appraisals, please let us know in the comments and we'll talk about it next time.
All right. We'll see ya.
Thanks.